Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Philippines Uncut for our second segment on tonight's topic, the Spratlys and AFP modernization. And joining us still is General Defensor Benjamin Defensor, former Chief of Staff and Chairman of the APEX Task Force on Counterterrorism. Welcome back, General, for our second segment. Now, sir, to start this second segment, let's talk about the Philippines' response to this conflict. One of the knee-jerk reaction of the government was, unsurprisingly, to run to our American friends and cite the Mutual Defense Treaty. In fact, Secretary Del Rosario, Foreign Affairs Secretary Alberto Del Rosario, and Defense Secretary Voltaire Gazmin flew to the States, met with Hillary Clinton. What can you say, sir, about what transpired? I mean, it's in the papers, it's in all the papers that the U.S. response to our concerns has been lukewarm, let's say not as we had expected, or not as the Philippine government had wanted it to be.
You cannot really expect the United States to assist us directly in this kind of issue, because the Mutual Defense Treaty states that an attack on one territory should be responded to by both parties. But there is a difference, because in the United States, they have to respond in accordance with their constitutional processes. Supposing their government says, no, we don't have to involve ourselves there, so we'll be left hanging and will be left alone. That's one. Number two is when you talk of the Mutual Defense Treaty, which was a treaty signed by the United States and the Philippines after the Second World War, you are creating a military relations between the United States and the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And in the Spratlys or Scarborough issue, you are involving China. What is China and what is the United States? Both are members, permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. And why is there a Security Council of the United Nations? There is a Security Council because that council was created specifically to prevent wars, to prevent aggression, to prevent conflict.
Hence the irony.
And gusto natin pawayan yung dalawa doon just because of a little sandbar in Scarborough.
But is the U.S. obliged or duty-bound to come to the Philippines? Let's say some manner of conflict does arise from this. Are they duty-bound?
I think it's not whether they're duty-bound. The things that you have to ask here is, number one, what is the direction that the United States and China are going to? Because they're the two superpowers in the world. And as a matter of fact, ang pinakamalaking nagpapautang sa Amerika is yung China. But China and the United States both have special relations with the Philippines.
Yes.
No Filipino, I think, has no relative in the United States. In the same way that there are so many Chinese Filipinos who go to the mainland. Nandun lahat yan sa Xiamen, sa Gulangyo, nagbabakasyon. So it's really a tricky issue. And we cannot just invoke a treaty like the Mutual Defense Treaty for something that happens there. There are many ways of doing it. Mm-hmm. One, like I said earlier, is going to the International Tribunal Court for the decision by the court on the interpretation of the law of the sea. The other is to engage
our partners
in ASEAN partners, and maybe even bring it to the level of APEC, of which I am familiar with, because the United States and China are there in APEC, but you do not have to talk about Scarborough Shoal or the Spratlys issue. You can talk about navigational routes and trade routes, because APEC is about securing trade. That's why ang magic word in APEC is STAR, secure trade in the Asia-Pacific region. So when you do that, you're not bringing out the issue of who owns which territory, but how we can help each other.
Yes. This actually, sir, is a solution being proposed by a very good common friend of ours, former Speaker Joe De Venecia, who proposed last year.
And that was what I'm going to propose also, that there are many ways of engaging China. As a matter of fact, that's a technique that they have in the United Nations. They get smart guys, they get very good diplomats, but they get what I call a special forces team. These are extraordinarily skilled people who have connections in a country, in government, in business, up to the restaurants. They know where to go, whom to contact with, and get in touch with. As a matter of fact, many of the things that I used in APEC when I was the chairman of the Counterterrorism Task Force was techniques that they taught me, and they're still around. They were even able to get Vietnam, in a visit to Vietnam, a commitment from Vietnam not to attack, for Vietnam and the Philippines not to attack each other in the Spratly.
The Spratlys.
Can you beat that kind of commitment?
So how come this can't be replicated with China?
They can replicate it. It's much easier to deal with China than with Vietnam because we have many Filipino Chinese, but we don't have much Filipino Vietnamese right now.
What Speaker De Venecia also said was for all parties to renounce claims to the entire area and have a joint, exploitation or joint development of the area.
It's a face-saving gesture because the moment you make one side lose face, lalong magmamatigas yan eh. Because nobody wants to lose face in an international issue. So you save face, you propose something like that, a joint
where everyone benefits, a win-win situation for everyone.
Somebody was even suggesting na magkaroon lang tayo ng sports games like what they have in Boracay, doon sa Spratly at Scarborough. Gustong-gusto din naman mga yan. You go to Vietnam, you go to China, you go to... Lahat sila sa beaches din naman. Nakikipag-beach volleyball, maybe they can have water polo there or swimming competitions, that kind of stuff.
Because, sir, I mean, under the current... the current approach, the military approach, the saber-rattling approach, it's not going to work. It's not going to... Number one, we're militarily, I mean, we're at a gross disadvantage, to say the least.
Yes.
And we have no clout economically in the region to push something like this.
In today's time, a responsive and credible military is almost a sine qua non for political recognition. Kung wala kang ibubuga sa armed forces mo, bali wala ka eh in this exchanges right now, because political power or political recognition grows out of a strong armed forces of that country.
As Mao Zedong
once said. So if we have a strong Air Force and Navy, I don't think people will go there easily and then like what they're doing now. Medyo mag-iisip yun.
If Subic Bay, if the U.S. forces were still in Subic Bay, sir, would China have been able to encroach on our territory like this?
I really...
That's a question a lot of people ask these days. Because a lot of people are saying, kasi kayo, pinalis nyo yung mga Amerikano, ngayon, tatakbo-takbo kayo sa kanila kasi
Subic
kailangan
Bay
ng tulong.
is a beautiful place.
Yes.
Subic Bay is a rare place because the aircraft carriers can go there. It has a deep port. Subic Bay is probably the only place in the Philippines that can be a tourist spot and a military base at the same time, and can be reached by Metro Manila in 1 hour 30 by land on the Philippines' most modern highway. So Subic is a treasure. That is why if we are going to invite investors, invite them to Subic, not only because it was a former Navy base, but because it is one of the best places to develop and invest in.
Yes, sir.
But if the Americans were there,
would it be so easy for China to build structures on in the areas claimed by the Philippines?
I don't think those things will be happening. Not because the United States is here, will be in Subic, but because there are other considerations there. Because the national strategy of the United States is global, and China is slowly having a global strategy also as part of its national strategy. Vis-a-vis the strategy of the Philippines, the national strategy of the Philippines, which is only territorial. Yun lang yung strategy natin. And so you have to understand why the United States acts that way. You have to understand why China acts this way. Iba-iba ang perspective.
Yes. And as I said in the first segment, General, what this tension in the Spratlys has really underscored is the need to develop and modernize our armed forces. As you said a few minutes ago, political power, diplomatic power flows out of military power, out of the barrel of a gun. And it really highlights that need. Now, let's talk about Philippines' AFP modernization. For the longest time, the AFP has been designed for internal conflict, not really for external aggression, but internal conflict. As you know, we've been battling a Muslim and communist rebel insurgency for 30 years, over 30 years. And so how do you see now the armed forces transforming itself into a new body that will be in a better position to face these new challenges of the 21st century?
A military force or an armed force, there are always three perspectives or three schools of thought.
Yes, sir.
The Army normally uses the continental school of thought. the Air Force will use the aerospace school of thought, and the Navy will use the maritime school of thought. Each of them have their own biases. And that is why when I was Air Force commander, we batted for a modernization program that will not only guard our skies, not only guard our territories, but can be used in internal security operations, what we call the ISO.
Okay.
I will give an example.
Okay.
You talk of a surface attack aircraft, you talk of a multi-role fighter.
Okay.
You cannot have the firepower of a multi-role fighter or a surface attack aircraft if you're just using ground fire. It is more accurate upstairs, especially when you are operating in areas like North Cotabato, in Buldon, or in Hulo or Basilan, where we had been operating. What I'm saying is there are dual uses for weapon systems. But again, the priority will have to be determined by whoever is the chief of the armed forces of the Philippines and the Secretary of National Defense at that time. And that is why it is very important that when you choose commanders, when there is a conflict, get commanders who have combat experience. From the time they were lieutenants, nagpapatrolya na yan, naintindihan nila kung anong kailangan eh. Do not get commanders who just go to a unit just because they have to go through the process of having field assignments.
Yes,
get the right commanders to do it, and then give them the right weapon system. Yeah. That is why we emphasized first on, right now, choppers, because it has a dual use. It's not only a platform for war.
It's also support for
troops. The most useful equipment that we have, especially when there are typhoons and disaster operations, because these are the things that we will need when you try to save lives of people, and you try to save properties of people. But again, without the Americans here, we were handicapped greatly, because if there is a crash in a mountain, or there's somebody who gets lost in a mountain or a sea, we can only rely on our old, on our aging aircraft. And we didn't have the big Chinooks or the big Jolly C-47s of the Americans, which were very useful for disaster operations. But we are trying to get them back, and make them our own and use them. But that takes a long time. That's
How come the Americans are not giving us better equipment? Like we always hear about in the news sometimes of 10 Hueys being turned over, and as we know, these are probably 25, 30 years old. Yes. Why don't they give us better stuff if you have this special relationship with them?
You can accept the Hueys if they are upgraded Hueys. Yes. They call it the Huey 2, change the engine, stronger rotor, it can fly faster, it can pick up faster. But then you will need a big amount again to do that. And when you get something from the military assistance program, or from the foreign military sales, which we have with the United States, you get equipment that have to be refurbished, that has to be upgraded, and you will spend a lot of money on that, because that's the only thing that our budget can afford. It's not actually a hand-me-down. So even when you try to buy an equipment in the modernization program, you do not just compute the acquisition cost. How much does this weapon cost? You compute what we call the life cycle cost. How much is needed to maintain it for so many years? How much is needed to upgrade it at a certain period of time? And how much is the total life cycle cost? Yes. And again, the life cycle cost of weapon systems vary. Some are 10 years, some are 15, some are 20. So you can get a fighter, a multi-role fighter, free. Pero bubugbugin ka naman sa maintenance yan through the years. There's a luma.
General, there's talk that the Philippines is trying to acquire F-16s, and F-16s, as you know, are a multi-role fighter. Do you see the wisdom in this? Do we need F-16s?
Well, number one, if you are pro F-16, you can always easily argue for the F-16, because there are many F-16s in the world. There are many UH-1Hs in the world. There are many C-130s in the world. So in terms of spare parts, madali kang makahiram, lalo na sa mga kaibigan mo sa ASEAN, which we were doing before. Pag may nasira kaming C-130 sa Malaysia, ang sinasabi ng mga kaibigan namin na Malaysians doon, we'll give you the engine, just make sure you return it after you go back to the Philippines. Ganon ang relationship natin sa other military countries. The F-16 is a common aircraft among NATO countries and among the allies of the United States, but there are many versions of the F-16. If they give us the F-16AB, then I told Secretary Del Rosario, get the F-16C, because the AB had a defect. So parang may diferensya yung modelo na yan. Kumuha ka na ng mas bago.
Yes,
but
sir.
of course, newer model, bigger cost.
Yes, sir. Given the Philippines' meager budget for defense, where do you think, General, aside from, as you mentioned, radar, in surveillance aircraft. Where are the other areas that you think we should prioritize?
Well, we have always to look at it from the point of view of disaster and relief operations, because we have an average of 21 typhoons every day. What do you need when there are typhoons? The C-130, or maybe just a smaller version of the C-130. Because the reason why, even though the C-130 is very useful, sometimes we have to fully load it for it to be effective, to lessen on the cost. So sometimes you need a smaller aircraft, which we do not have, that can perform some of the job, some of the roles of the C-130. That could be the C-27J, which they are proposing in the modernization program. That's one. The other is perhaps you need a smaller aircraft, smaller than the Fokker, that can ferry VIP flights, that can ferry reconnaissance flights, that can help in other operations, not necessarily military operations. There are many. The more aircraft that you have and the more aircraft that you can maintain, the more cost effective your Air Force becomes. It's like having, you don't use a truck to go to the Palenque. You don't use a Mercedes-Benz to bring children to school. You need maybe a multi-cab to do all of this, if that is only your budget. But like we said, like some of my friends in the Air Force say, we have a multi-cab there. It's the S-260. They call it the multi-cab of the aircraft, because it can perform reconnaissance, it can perform air-to-ground missions, it can be used as a training aircraft. It's all around.
Pero sir, mukhang bias tayo sa Air Force, ah.
Yes,
No,
obvious.
but realistically, what are they, aside from the Air Force,
like
how
I said,
about the Navy?
Like I said, you know, when you play chess, you have to have strong openings, and you bring the discussion to that opening. But in terms of the Navy, pareho din ang requirements. They need corvettes, they need frigates, they need new ships, they need better LSTs, aircraft that can carry big loads, because not all of the time everything can be done by the Air Force. So if you want to construct, say, a bigger runway in Pag-asa Island, in Spratly, you will need the Navy there.
Yes,
because
sir.
they're the ones who can bring the rocks that you will use.
The
in
CBs.
Yes, the CBs. They bring the rocks that can extend the runway, so we can have maybe a 747 landing in the Spratlys, and have people the time of their life.
Yes,
maybe,
sir.
and then invite the Vietnamese and the Malaysians to have a good time with us instead of fighting.
Do you foresee a smaller army, a smaller infantry, smaller army going forward?
Yes. Right now, we cannot reduce them yet, because we have this Abu Sayyaf issue. We have the NPAs all around. We have the renegades from both the MNLF and MILF side, and you cannot just reduce them, because anytime
can the PNP handle
no, I'm saying no, because it was already returned to the armed forces. The ISO operations, which was handled by the PNP, was returned to the AFP in 2004. So,
hindi kaya.
solo lang.
Talagang hindi kaya.
But even if it is with the AFP, ang PNP will still have to help, because it's still the same situation that we had in the 70s, where the PNP was a branch of service of the AFP, and they were doing the same things. So under a unified command concept, sometimes it is a PNP who is the commander of all the units there. Sometimes it is an army man, sometimes it is an Air Force man who commands all the units involved in ISO operations. So baka siguro pag titingnan natin ulit ito, baka mas magandang ibalik na lang natin yung PNP sa AFP, kasi when they are in the field and they get an enemy, they have a common enemy, whoever encounters the enemy first engages the enemy and gets help from the other. So parehas din.
Yes, sir. Sir, given what's happening to Spratlys now, do you see at least favorable signs that the Aquino administration is moving in this direction, beefing up the Navy, beefing up the Air Force, finally that this administration, after so many administrations, will focus on this very much needed improvement in the armed forces?
What any beefing up, any increase in assets, particularly capability that will improve the capability of the AFP, will always be welcome. The new modernization program that they have envisions a budget of 470 billion for the next 15 years versus the 330 billion that we proposed initially in 1995, when I was part of the group that prepared the blueprint.
Then, sir, 330 billion is not the 330 billion today.
But at that time, the exchange rate was 22:1.
Oh, yes,
now
sir.
it's 43.
Yes, sir.
So your 440 is maybe
200 million.
200 billion.
Yes,
Edi mas kokonti pa kaysa noon.
Yes, sir.
That is the problem, and we cannot make decisions fast. We have to decide, and when you have decided, don't doubt anymore. Just go for it, because if you choose a weapon system from different proponents, all of them have strengths and weaknesses. because these weapon systems that we are proposing, even if we have parameters, cannot fit exactly into the parameters that you are preparing because they are already built. Hindi naman yan schoolhouse na sinabi mo 20 meters by 30 meters, ito yung bubong. Nagawa na yan eh. So you just have to look for one that is closest to what you need. And the moment you get one, you cannot have everything there because the other one will have what you will need. So if you look at it from another perspective, mali na naman yung choice mo. You better decide already.
Given the big problems of the Philippines and obviously our deficit, our budget deficit in many areas, are you optimistic that the armed forces will eventually become the armed forces that you would like it to be?
It will become the armed forces that I would like to have. It will become the armed forces that the younger officers would like to have. It should be the armed forces that our fathers wanted to have.
Yes, sir.
Because you remember, the Mutual Defense Treaty is an offshoot of the Second World War because the Americans and the Filipinos were fighting side by side. And when the Americans say stop, we stop. When the Americans say fight, we fight. That was wrong. That's why we got cornered in Bataan and Corridor because the American commander said, you wait for reinforcements there.
Static defensive position.
And it was like the Alamo, depending on the troops.
Yes, sir.
But the troops that were coming never came. So surrender. Anong ginawa ng mga marking guerrillas, ng mga Hunter ROTC guerrillas? Anong ginawa ng Panay Freedom Forces?
Guerrilla forces.
Sabi ng mga Amerikano, surrender na tayo because that is the order from the top. Sabi ng mga Pilipino naman, yung mga guerrilla forces natin, surrender ka mag-isa mo, lalabang kami. And they are the people that we should celebrate during the araw ng kagitingan because lumalaban sila. They
never surrendered. Yes,
they never surrendered because alam nilang surrender ka, bubugbugin ka lang. Eh, bakit ka magsusurrender? Eh, di lumabang ka na lang.
General, would you like to say something to our viewers before we go?
Yes. There are many changes in our world today. And the universe is so ordered that we have to learn from each other. We have to understand each other because no nation is sufficient in itself. No nation is wise in itself. Each has to learn and to engage each other. No nation, no matter how economically strong or militarily advanced, can resolve issues alone. They have to have exchanges. That is why, in what we are having now, the best way to deal with this is to engage each other, to have constructive engagement, instead of listening to people who say that they like to hear the drums of war beat. And as a matter of fact, one of these guys in the People Daily who said, you better resolve the issue peacefully, otherwise you hear the sound of cannons. To that, we have an answer. Tell him that at this time, wala nang cannon. Ang pinag-usapan, mga missiles na, beyond visual range missile, pwede mong paputukin sa bangka na ibabagsak niya ang 5th generation fighter because he has a more superior fire control system.
Thank you very much, General.
Thank you.
And I look forward to having you again, sir, as we talk about security issues, and I'm sure there will be a lot of them in the days and weeks to come. Salamat po.
Yes. Always an interesting issue.
Thank you, sir. I hope that all of you are now more enlightened about the Spratlys issue and AFP modernization. Let's hope that our leaders can work together to resolve this tension in the Spratlys peacefully and for everyone's mutual benefit. Let's all hope for the best. I'll see you again next week on this show where we talk about what matters to you because you matter the most. See you next week. Segment. Now, sir, to start this second segment, let's talk about the Philippines' response to this conflict. One of the knee-jerk reaction of the government was, unsurprisingly, to run to our American friends and cite the Mutual Defense Treaty. In fact, Secretary Del Rosario, Foreign Affairs Secretary Alberto Del Rosario, and Defense Secretary Voltaire Gazmin flew to the States, met with Hillary Clinton, What can you say, sir, about what transpired? I mean, it's in the papers, it's in all the papers that the U.S. response to our concerns has been lukewarm, let's say. Let's say not as we had expected or not as the Philippine government had wanted it to be.
You cannot really expect the United States to assist us directly in this kind of issue because the Mutual Defense Treaty states that an attack on one territory should be responded to by both parties. But there is a difference because in the United States, they have to respond in accordance with their constitutional processes. Supposing their government says, no, we don't have to involve ourselves there. So we'll be left hanging and we'll be left alone. That's one. Number two is when you talk of the Mutual Defense Treaty, which was a treaty signed by the United States and the Philippines after the Second World War, you are creating a relations between a military relations.
They're duty bound.
I think it's not whether they're duty bound. The things that you have to ask here is number one, what is the direction that the United States and China are going to? Because they're the two superpowers in the world. And as a matter of fact, ang pinakamalaking nagpapautang sa Amerika is yung China. But China and the United States both have special relations with the Philippines.
Yes.
No Filipino, I think, has no relative in the United States. In the same way that there are so many Chinese Filipinos who go to the mainland. Nandun lahat yan sa Xiamen, sa Gulangyo, nagbabakasyon. So it's really a tricky issue. And we cannot just
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Philippines Uncut for our second segment on tonight's topic, the Spratlys and AFP modernization. And joining us still is General Defensor Benjamin Defensor, former Chief of Staff and Chairman of the APEX Task Force on Counterterrorism. Welcome back, General, for our second
military relations between the United States and the Philippines. And in the Spratly or Scarborough issue, you are involving China. What is China and what is the United States? Both are permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. And why is there a Security Council of the United Nations? There is a Security Council because that council was created specifically to prevent wars, to prevent aggression, to prevent conflict.
Hence the irony.
And gusto natin pawayan yung dalawa doon just because of a little sandbar in Scarborough.
But is the U.S. obliged or duty bound to come to the Philippines? Let's say some manner of conflict does arise from this.